Root Cause, an Isabella Proctor cozy paranormal mystery short story written by Bouchard.
Chapter 1. "I can't wait until tomorrow night," my cousin Delia said as she held up her navy blue ceremonial robe and spun around. My bright berry-colored robe lay on my bed. I'd been staring at it, waiting for the time I could put on my first adult magical robe. I traced my fingers along the metallic embroidery that ran across the front, wondering how long it had taken my mother to stitch the intricate vines, stars, and moons. My other cousin, Thea, sat down at my desk. "It's going to be so much better. Finally, we're going to be able to learn some real magic. No more of this baby stuff that doesn't have any real power." Delia lay her robe on my bed. "Just think, Isabella, at last we'll be able to do useful things." "I know," I said. "Chores are going to be a lot easier if we can do them with a snap of our fingers." While that was true, I was much more interested in learning how to make potions than anything else. Potions can help everyone, and I wanted to use my magic to help everyone. My cousins and I stayed in my bedroom, staying out of the way of our mothers while they prepared for our second investiture. Second investiture was one of the most important ceremonies in a young witch's life, and the three of us were all going through it at the same time. It's the first time we would be able to say what we wanted, and at 14, that was a big deal for us. First investiture, when we were 7, was kind of a blur. 7-year-olds aren't very awake at midnight. Remembered people kissing me and telling me how excited they were for me before I snuck away and fell asleep in the corner of Grandpa's study. This investiture was exciting because Grandma had decided to invite non-family members to witness it as well. Ordinarily, witches keep their secrets within their family, but Grandma had decided it was time to start trusting other families and had taken the first step by inviting the Packards and the Browns. Not only had she invited them to tomorrow's investiture, she insisted they come early and spend the night as our guests here at Proctor House. I would have resented the work we had to do, except that I was as excited to have people here as Grandma, and because she took the opportunity to teach Thea, Delia, and I some more advanced spells to make our share of the chores go faster. The front doorbell rang, and the three of us ran down the stairs, almost running into our mothers, who were also rushing to the door. My mother put her hand on the brass doorknob. "Are we ready?" Grandma and Grandpa joined us from the kitchen. "Isabella," Grandma hissed at me, "did you get everything for the guests in their rooms?" I nodded. Grandma was going out of her way for our house guests. She liked the idea of entertaining other people and wanted to make a good impression. To that end, we had fancy towels for them to use, and each room had a tray of snacks they could nibble on, fruit, crackers, and cookies that we'd made earlier that morning.
"Open the door, Michelle." My mother threw open the door. "Welcome to Proctor House."
Our first guest was Great Aunt Jemima, Grandma's sister and the oldest member of our family. She stepped forward, using her Purple Heart cane to assist her. Her long gray hair was pulled into a French twist, and her blue eyes sparkled with happiness. "And where are my lovely nieces?" Aunt Jem asked. Thea, Delia, and I stepped forward to hug her. "Ooh, careful, girls. I'm not as young as I look." "Can I take your bag, Auntie Jem?" Aunt Nadia asked. "Thank you, Nadia. That would be lovely. Be careful. There are delicate presents for tomorrow night in there." "Presents?" Delia asked. "Would I come to visit without bringing you something from Sewell?" Sewell was a town in upstate New Hampshire, strictly for witches. The town was warded, and non-magical people could not find it, making it safe to do magic anywhere within the bounds of town. Sewell had the best magic shops in the country, and Auntie Jem's gifts were always amazing. Grandma took Auntie Jem's hand and led her and Grandpa into the living room. "I'll get tea," Aunt Lily said to their retreating backs. Before we closed the door, our next set of guests arrived. The elegantly dressed couple were strangers to me, so I held my hand out and said, "Welcome to Proctor House. I'm Isabella Proctor, I'm Percy Brown, and this is my wife Octavia." I stepped aside and let them in. Mrs. Brown looked at our large entryway in awe. "What a marvelous home you have here. Nothing at all like we have in Sewell." "Could I give you a tour later, Mrs. Brown?" Delia asked. She laughed. "You must call me Octavia now that you are becoming adults." It was nice that someone acknowledged we were becoming adults. To hear it from our mothers, We were still children and would be treated that way for several more years. "Why don't we help you with your bags and get you settled in your rooms first?" I said, ticking off the items on Grandma's list of things a good hostess did. Percy thrust his bag into my outstretched hand, while Olivia gave one bag to Thea and one to Delia. "Be careful with that last one, please." Aunt Nadia smiled at the couple. "While the girls bring your bags upstairs, please join me in the living room for some tea." Thea, Delia, and I carried the Browns' bags to Thea's room, which had been turned into a guest room. We set them down, and I gave the room a quick look. The fresh flowers on the bureau looked good, the new towels and soaps we'd bought rested neatly on the bedside table, and the plate of snacks sat on Thea's cleaned-off desk. I could still see the vacuum marks on the carpet, and there wasn't a speck of dust in the room. The doorbell rang, and we rushed to the front door. Thea opened the door and welcomed our guests. "I'm Charles Packard, and this is my wife, Emma," said the short man. He was a couple inches shorter than me, maybe 5 feet 3 inches. His wife was even shorter. "Welcome to our home. I'm Thea, and these are my cousins Isabella and Delia." The hand-shaking Grandma made us practice came in handy, and if she had been paying attention, she would have been proud of us. "Can we take your bags?" I asked. "Oh, not to worry," said Emma Packard. "We don't have much to carry." We led them upstairs to Delia's room and let them get settled while we sat into my room. I threw myself on my bed, careful not to crush my robe while my cousins sat on their air mattresses. Chapter 2. After a dinner whose guiding principle could be called "children should be seen and not heard," Thea, Delia, and I went to my room. Now, don't get me wrong. Usually we were encouraged to share our opinions about anything we wanted to, and to debate with the aunts, but this was not allowed that night. We sat quietly and separated far enough from each other that we couldn't have our own conversation. When Grandma said we could leave the table, we were thrilled. Listening to old people remembering the people we never knew and relive the times we weren't even alive for was going to turn me old before my time. A creak on the landing woke me from a light sleep. "Who's there?" I wasn't worried when no one answered. Our house was warded against intruders, like all witch houses were. It was probably one of our guests having trouble sleeping. We woke up early but stayed in bed for a bit, talking. Since none of us remembered much about our ceremony when we were 7, we didn't know what to expect. "It can't be all that bad, or we'd at least remember that, right?" I asked. It bothered us that the aunts wouldn't tell us what to expect. We'd talked long into the night last night about what we wanted for our futures, and we all decided we were going to remain students, and that if we didn't take Grandma's advice to move to intermediate studies, that it could be a difficult 7 years. My alarm rang at 6:30, and 2 minutes later Aunt Nadia tapped on my door. "Girls, are you awake?" she asked. I opened the door and let the aunts in. "Good morning, girls," said my mother. "Are you ready for your day? I'm so excited for tonight and your new commitment," Aunt Nadia said. "It's going to be a wonderful night, but first we need your help down in the kitchen," Aunt Lily said. "Great. We get to help make breakfast, too. I only hoped the dishes were done from dinner last night." I didn't like the idea of tackling that pile before breakfast. Down in the kitchen, Grandma was cutting fruit into a bowl. "Good morning, Grandma," we all said, kissing her on the cheek. She stood up and hugged each of us. "Look at you 3, about to take one of the most important steps of a young witch's life today." She wiped a tear from her eye and said, "No matter what you choose, I am proud of each of you for the young woman you are now, and for the woman I think you will become." "Thank you, Grandma," said Thea. "You know we always work hard because we want you to be proud of us." Grandma wiped her hands on her apron and said, "Yes, well, make me proud by getting to work on breakfast. Delia, you make the pancakes. Thea, you make the eggs. And Isabella, you fry up the bacon. We'll eat in a half an hour." Half an hour was not that long to cook breakfast for 13 people, unless you had our kitchen and some magical help. The kitchen had a griddle that covered the 6 burners of the stovetop, meaning Delia would only need to make 2 batches of pancakes. On the other stove? What do you mean your house doesn't have 2 stoves? The aunts used to run a catering business, so not only do we have everything you could imagine, we almost always have 2 of them. On the other stove, Thea and I could make the eggs and bacon just as quickly. I could smell muffins in the oven already, courtesy of the Aunt Nadia. Coffee was brewing and everything seemed to be going to plan. How did I know it was all going to plan? Because the kitchen's chalkboard had a plan written down on it. Food, activities, ceremony. It was all up there with jobs and lists. Aunt Delia had charmed the board, and when one task was finished, it was checked off and the next task assigned. The smell of breakfast brought our guests downstairs, and we brought the food out to the sideboard in the dining room. Grandpa was lighting a fire in the fireplace as we walked in. Aunt Lily was setting the sideboard up with plates and cutlery. Once the Packards and Browns joined us, we were ready to eat. Grandma looked around at everyone in the room. "I suppose we should get Jemima. She'll be angry if she misses breakfast." "I'll go get her," I offered. I walked up the stairs and down the hall to her room and knocked on the door. "Auntie Jem, are you awake?" She didn't answer, so I tried the doorknob. The door swung open for me with a small creak. All our bedrooms had heavy velvet drapes that blocked all the early morning light, making it easy to oversleep. "Aunt Jem?" I whispered. I walked to the window and opened one of the curtains. Sunlight flooded the room, but Auntie Jem didn't move. "Wake up, sleepyhead, or you'll miss breakfast." I looked at the four-poster bed, and it felt like time froze. Aunt Jemima was laying on the bed, her open eyes bulging out. My heart skipped a beat and then began to pound. Something was wrong with her. I put my finger to her wrist to check for a pulse, but couldn't find one. She wasn't breathing either, and I didn't know what to do. I'd never found a dead aunt in a bed before. Should I call the police? Should I get Grandma up here? I stuck my head out the bedroom door and yelled, "Mom, can you come here for a minute?" I tried to keep the panic out of my voice. I'm not sure I succeeded because all three aunts came running. At the doorway, my mother took one look at me and said, "What is it?" I pointed at Aunt Jemima and didn't say anything. Aunt Lily and Aunt Nadia rushed past me and checked for her pulse. Aunt Nadia straightened up and looked at my mother, who had not left my side. She shook her head and I started to cry. My mother put her arm around me and said, "It's not your fault, sweetie." I knew it wasn't my fault, but I'd never seen a dead body before, and I didn't know how to feel about it. I guess my default is crying. "I'll have to call the police," said Aunt Nadia. Aunt Lily snapped her head up and said, "Not Roy." Aunt Nadia said, "There's not much I can do about that. They'll send whoever they send. We can keep him away from you, though." I had no idea what they were talking about. We had much bigger worries than Aunt Lily not liking a detective. "How?" asked Aunt Nadia. "I'm checking," replied Aunt Lily. She closed her eyes for a moment, a look of deep concentration etched on her face. When she opened her eyes, she shook her head. I brushed the tears from my eyes and looked to my mother. "Aunt Jem wasn't killed by a spell," she said. I nodded, hoping she'd died of natural causes. The thought of a killer in the house was terrifying. "We'll need to get our story straight, too," my mother said as she led us all downstairs. Aunt Nadia took Grandma and Grandpa aside. "There's no easy way to say this." She took a deep breath and continued. "Aunt Jem is dead." Grandma didn't say anything for a moment, and I could see emotion playing on her face. Disbelief, surprise, then pain. Silent tears ran down Grandma's cheeks, and we could hear Grandpa comforting her. Aunt Lily got us all situated in the drawing room to give Grandma time to pull herself together, much to the consternation of our hungry guests. "We have a problem. Jemima has passed, and we need to call the police." Mr. and Mrs. Packard paled at the news. The Browns blanched as well. "What? How did it happen?" asked Emma Packard. "We don't know. I didn't find any magic lingering in the room, so it was probably natural causes. She wasn't young, you know," said Aunt Lily. Mr. Brown shifted in his seat. "Who found her?" "I did. I meant it to come out loud and in command, but all I could manage was a timid whisper." "You?" he asked. "Well, there's our first suspect right there." He jumped up and strode across the room, then squatted until he was nose to nose with me. "Tell me, girl, why did you kill your aunt?" I shrank into my mother's arms, trying to avoid his morning breath. "I didn't kill her." Why would I want to do that? He stood straighter and looked at all the other witches in the room. We all know, although we don't say, that young witches, particularly those who are under a lot of stress to pass their first training, often do things which may seem rational to themselves in the moment, but which are actually quite harmful to themselves or others. I didn't kill her. I heard the stairs creaking last night, though, I said. Now you just wait a minute, Aunt Nadia said. Before she could go on, Octavia started to speak. Shut up, Percy. You sound like an idiot. Of course this little girl didn't kill Jemima. Look at her, she can barely speak or look at anyone. The poor girl is in shock and should have our concern, not our accusations. She patted the couch next to her, and Percy sat down like a trained dog returning to his position. Nadia is calling the police, and we have to agree that we are here for a celebration for the girls. There's no sense bringing the police into our private business. There were nods around the room, but Percy didn't look convinced. Percy? My mother asked. It doesn't take much for a girl to snap in this day and age, and she probably thinks she's being clever making up a little story about hearing someone out in the hallway last night. Damn it, man, said Charles. You need to shut up before you embarrass yourself anymore. If she did it, the police will figure it out. I guess you're right, said Percy, and I'll go along with the lie as long as she, he pointed at me, isn't left alone for a single second. I think we can arrange that, my mother said. I wouldn't want her alone with you accusing her anyway. We all know how little it takes to run afoul of male fragility. 5 minutes of us accusing each other and arguing about the dead woman upstairs, and the police arrived. It was almost a relief. Grandma opened the door, her eyes red from crying. Dobbins, she said, anger seething through her clenched teeth. Ma'am, I'm sorry for your loss. There was no one else available to come this morning. I promise I'll treat your situation with the utmost discretion and tact if you'll let me. I think it's about time I did something for this family. Grandma nodded and stepped aside, letting the officer pass. Dobbins shook Grandpa's hand. I'll do my best to be thorough and get out of your way as soon as possible, sir. Why was Grandma angry with a police detective? And why was that detective willing to be so accommodating to the family? I'll bring you upstairs, Aunt Nadia volunteered. Did you find the victim? Dobbins asked. I found her, I said. He turned to me. And your name is? Isabella Proctor. My mother took a step toward him. She's my daughter. A little something went out of Dobbins, but he quickly recovered. All right, then. Isabella, I'd like you to come with us. I want you to show me what you were doing when you found Mrs. Proctor. My mother led the detective and me to Aunt Jem's room, and I heard the same creak in the stair I heard last night. Once in the room, I ran through exactly what I did not an hour before. And has she been moved since you saw her? He asked. I shook my head. No, she's in the same position I found her in. Aunt Lily and Aunt Delia checked her pulse and no one else was in here. We'll have to ask you all to wait downstairs while we process the room. We'll have the coroner come in, too. He walked to my mother and said, Michelle, you have to believe me. If there was anyone else available, I would have stayed away. I keep my promises. My mother nodded and patted his arm. Do what you can for Aunt Jemima. Chapter 3. After an excruciating morning of individual questioning in the kitchen and then sitting in the parlor not daring to talk to each other, the police left, declaring poor Aunt Jem had died of natural causes. Grandpa called a funeral home and they took Auntie Jem away as soon as the police let them. Once we were sure we were alone, my mother took charge of the situation in a way I'd never seen before. She stood up and addressed the room in a tone that would not let her be ignored. Now that that's out of the way, we can get to the truth. Jemima was murdered. I looked to my cousins in shock. Why would she say that? And if she thought it was true, why wouldn't she tell the police? What makes you say that? Asked Emma Packard. The family grimoire is missing, my mother replied. My cousins and I gasped. The grimoire is the book we keep all the spells the family knows. Aunt Jem kept ours in Sewell because the town is warded and almost impossible to steal from. She brought it with her this weekend because Grandma and the aunts wanted to add some new spells. Was she killed for the book? I asked. It looks like it. Lily and Nadia are searching the house for it now. It won't be long until we find it, and then we'll know who the murderer is." Everyone burst into proclamations of innocence at once. One person, I thought, was lying. "Can we go to my room?" I asked my mother. She sat next to me and said, "Not yet. Of course, none of you girls were involved. Try to hang in there a bit longer, and once we get this all worked out, you can go upstairs." I nodded and squeezed her hand. "We're not going through with the ceremony tonight, are we?"
"If we can clear this up, we will. If we can avoid waiting for another full moon, that would be best." If ceremonies are put off for too long, the luck of the house drains away. Nobody wants that to happen. It's never happened here, but Grandma has told us stories about houses that crumble down, inside and out, on families that try to avoid their magical responsibilities. Aunt Nadia came into the parlor and said, "Michelle, can we talk to you for a moment?" When they came back into the room, they looked grim. "Did you find the book?" Percy asked. "Yes, we found the book in Isabella's room," I said, before my mother cut me off. Regardless of what Percy had to say, this is an obvious setup. There is no way any of the girls would have done this, not when they were about to start learning from it. There would have been no need to steal what was available to them at any time. Nadia and Lily will be making a second search of all the rooms for incriminating evidence. This could take a while, so please be patient. Aunt Nadia and Lily left the room, and my mother sat next to me. I didn't want to say anything because I already knew Percy thought I did it, and if I talked anymore, I was afraid other people would think I did it too. Percy turned to his wife. "You know what I mean, don't you, Octavia?" She glowered at him, but he didn't get the message to shut up. "You were a young girl once, and I know you didn't always make good choices." He chuckled as though he knew some secrets about her. Her glower turned to a laser stare of death, and she said, "I swear to the goddess, Percy, if you don't shut up and stop accusing that girl of murder, I'll—" She didn't finish the threat, but he knew what she was going to say because he leaned back and stopped talking. The aunts must have searched thoroughly because it took them a long time to come downstairs. Aunt Lily was carrying a large tapestry bag that clinked as she walked. "This bag seems suspicious. Octavia, can you tell me what is in it?" Octavia stood up and walked to the bag. She set it on the coffee table and pulled out several vials of liquids. "These are some of the potions I make. I was planning to bring them to Trina Bassett tomorrow before we left. She asked me to make some for her new shop." "What are they?" Aunt Nadia asked. Octavia picked up one bottle and said, "This is protection tonic of basil, almond, and sandalwood." She opened the bottle and dropped 3 drops in her mouth. "See, not poisonous." She picked up the second bottle. "This is hibiscus and rose petal for energy." Again, she dropped 3 drops in her mouth. She picked up a third bottle and my stomach lurched. "Turmeric and dandelion for immune support." She lifted the dropper to her mouth. Before she could squeeze it, I yelled, "Stop!" I don't know how I knew, but I did. "It's not what you said. It's poison." Octavia looked at me curiously. She gave the bottle a gentle sniff and said, "Whatever it is, it's not turmeric and dandelion." Grandma picked up the bottle, closed her eyes, and after a moment she opened them and said, "Cow's bane." The adults in the room gasped. Whatever cow's bane was, it wasn't good. Octavia began to shake. I almost took a poison." The color drained from her face and her lips took on a gray tinge. Aunt Lily rushed to her side and helped her to an armchair. Aunt Lily knelt beside her and said, "Did you pack your potions?" Octavia nodded. "Were any of them poisons?" Lily asked. Octavia shook her head. I brought her a glass of water, which she refused. I don't blame her because I didn't feel like anything was safe right then either. I looked to Percy, who hadn't moved from his seat. Why wasn't he here, comforting his wife? Lily also turned to Percy. "Who else had access to your luggage?" "Sewell is a place where you trust your neighbors. Anyone could have walked in and switched bottles while they were visiting," he said. His answer didn't make any sense to me. Why would someone put poison in a bottle in Sewell, hoping it would make it to Portsmouth and Aunt Jem? The poison had to be put in the case by the person who used it and stole the grimoire. It went without saying that the book was invaluable.
Of course, someone from outside the family would want it, but this seemed to be a long way to go to get it. Percy put his hand on Olivia's shoulder. I could see he was actually hurting her with his grip. I don't know what kind of house you run here, Michelle, but I think it's best for us to leave before anyone else is killed. My wife was almost killed, and none of you are upset about it. Let's go, darling. I'm sure someone else can pack up our things and bring them to us later. Octavia shrank from his hand, but he didn't let go. No, we need to stay here and figure out who killed Jemima. She lowered her voice and whispered, because they would have killed me too, if Isabella hadn't spoken up. That's when it hit me. The murderer was in the room with us, and whoever it was knew she'd die when she was trying to prove her potions were safe, and they didn't care. A shiver ran through me. I'd never realized how cold and cruel people could be. After all, we were all close friends. At least we were until today. The girl only spoke up because she knew the bottle was poison. Ask yourself, how would she have known unless she was the one who did it? Said Percy. My eyes widened in panic. Surely no one would believe that I'd done this? They couldn't, could they? That's crazy. I'd never hurt someone. I tried to look fierce and brave before I broke down in tears at the thought that anyone could consider that I'd hurt someone. I was a Proctor witch, and we did not hurt others. Ever. Not even when we were being persecuted. Don't be a damned fool, spat Grandma. That child hasn't got a drop of malice in her. Isabella would no sooner kill her great-aunt as she would step on a bug. She walked to me and put her arm around my shoulders. We can ask. Isabella, honey, how did you know the bottle was poisoned? I wrung my hands. I didn't know how I knew, I just did. If I couldn't convince my family I was innocent, then I could be in big trouble. Like have the police arrest me for murder kind of trouble. I don't know. I got a feeling of dread in the pit of my stomach, like something bad would happen if I didn't speak up right then. Grandma smiled and gave my shoulders a squeeze. That's what I thought. She looked out at the rest of the people in the room and said, You see what I mean? She didn't do it, but she knows a bad potion when she's near one. I was confused. How could I tell a bad potion if I hadn't had much potion training? I'd had less training than any of my aunts, and definitely much less than Grandma. Grandpa stepped out of the room. I heard him talking in the kitchen. There was no one there. He must have been on the phone. Grandma, I don't understand, I said. You've got a rare potions talent that you might want to use in the future. Not yet. I bit my lip. I hadn't considered what I might do in the future because I didn't think I showed great talent in any area. I thought I'd be like a lot of modern witches and work in the normal world, using my powers for little, if anything at all. Despite the horrible circumstances, my heart soared to think I was a talented witch. If she didn't do it, it looks like it was either me, Charles, Octavia, or Perry, said Emma Packard. Seems to reason, said Grandma. Charles and I were together all the time we were here. We didn't give the poison to Jemima, she said. We were together all night as well, said Percy. Octavia was finally able to shake her husband's grip off her shoulder and stood up. No, we weren't. You said you couldn't sleep and said you were going to find a book in the library last night. Percy flushed and raised an arm to strike her. Charles jumped up with supernatural speed and caught Percy's wrist. Stop now! You don't want to get yourself in any more trouble than you're already in. Although he was much smaller than Percy, Charles didn't back down. Percy took a step back and said, How I treat my wife is none of your concern, Packard. Charles raised Percy's arm, forcing him to stand up. How you treat anyone is my concern. We all live by the same creed to harm none, and when one of us breaks it, it casts a din on all of us. Charles stepped backward until he had Percy in the middle of the room. Emma? Mrs. Packard turned to Grandma and said, It's your house. Do I have your permission? Grandma looked at her. It's the quickest way. Emma stood up and faced Percy. She stared at him, focusing her eyes on his. He tried to avoid her gaze, but was drawn in as her pupils enlarged. Did you kill Jemima? Percy clamped his lips shut and didn't say anything. She continued to stare, and Percy started to shake and sweat until he opened his mouth and snarled, Yes. He gestured at Octavia and said,
I was trying to kill her, too.
Octavia gasped. Aunt Nadia helped her up and brought her upstairs, saying there was no reason she needed to hear this. Good. Now, didn't that feel better? Emma asked in a deceptively soothing tone. Percy scowled and remained silent.
Now let me tell you what's going to happen next. The police are coming, and when they do, you will confess to the murder and attempted murder. You will hold nothing back, and you will go to jail for the rest of your life.
Only if a jury finds me guilty, Percy shot back. No trial and no jury. You will plead guilty and refuse any attempts at parole. If you don't, you know what Charles and I can do, and believe me, we will hunt you down and make every single day of your life not worth living. Also, you won't mention anything about the grimoire or our abilities. As if to emphasize his point, Emma stared into Percy's eyes again. Percy began to whimper and only nodded his agreement to the conditions. The front doorbell rang and was opened by Grandpa. I could see the same policeman who seemed to know the family had come back. He and Grandpa had a short conversation I couldn't hear.
Charles said, "Dobbins, this man has a confession to make."
Percy cleared his throat. He didn't speak until Emma glared at him.
"Yes, I want to confess."
He stood up and held his arms out to be handcuffed. Dobbins didn't waste any time handcuffing him and walking him out of the room.
"Call after he's booked,"
Grandpa asked. The detective nodded and brought Percy outside. I turned to the room full of people and let out a big sigh. We hadn't had breakfast yet, and there was so much still to do. My mother clapped her hands and got everyone's attention. "Well, that was certainly a dramatic morning. Why don't we all go into the kitchen, have some coffee and breakfast, and then decide how we want to proceed? I think it's safe to say we'd rather stay home than spend the day being mourning, distracted tourists." There were several nods as we walked into the kitchen. "Isabella, Thea, and Delia, I'd like to see you out here," my mother said before we made it to the kitchen. When we got to the end of the hall where she was standing, she said, "Girls, I know this has been a horrible day, and it's not even—" She looked at her watch. 10 in the morning. The adults are going to talk in the kitchen, and I'd like the 3 of you to grab some muffins and head upstairs to Isabella's room." "But—" "No buts, Thea. I promise we won't keep anything from you. And you know that we treat you respectfully as young adults. Right now, I want Octavia to speak freely, and I don't know that she'll do that if you 3 are there." Chapter 4. The rest of the day passed by in the blink of an eye. We all napped because we wanted to be wide awake for our midnight ceremony, and the stress of the morning had taken all our energy. We did talk a little bit about Charles being able to move so fast and Emma's ability to force people to tell the truth. We thought it was a good thing she didn't live near us, even though Grandma always seemed to be able to see through our little fibs, too. "Girls, please come downstairs with your robes on," Grandma called for us. We slipped our robes on and looked at each other. We were all nervous, but I knew with my cousins by my side we could do anything. We walked down the stairs to find our house empty, with a path of lit candle leading to the backyard. We followed the candles outside to a circle of people, all in their robes. We joined the circle, each standing next to our mothers. As I looked around the circle, I was surprised to notice how few men there were. Was it because men don't like ceremonies, or because the night was dedicated to 3 young women, or because there weren't that many men witches? Grandma started speaking, and I brought my attention to the ceremony. "Thank you all for coming to this ceremony for Isabella, Thea, and Delia. In a few moments, they will be declaring themselves for their next phase. Before they do, does anyone else need to make their declaration at this time?" She waited a full minute for anyone to come forward, but no one did. "Girls, please come forward and state your intentions." Now was our time. We joined Grandma and held hands. Because we all had the same intention, we decided to speak together rather than take turns. We were all born within 3 weeks of each other and acted like triplets rather than cousins. It didn't make sense in our hearts that one should go before another. Maybe in another 7 years, when we might choose different intentions. But not tonight. We choose to continue learning from our elders, learning all we can from those we most cherish as intermediate students. We weren't given anything we had to say, So we came up with this simple vow that stated our intention and let us tell our family how much we loved them. We hadn't known how much more we would cherish them after losing Aunt Jemima when we worked this out last week. We joined our mothers in the circle, and as the circle closed, I felt a strong rush of power surge through me. Many people around the circle gasped, also feeling the strength of the commitment. My mother squeezed my hand and kissed the top of my head. "Well done, sweetheart. Who will teach these young women?" Grandma asked the circle. The aunts said, "We will," in unison. I wondered if they knew what we had planned or were making it up as the night went along. Maybe they had always planned to each take responsibility for the three of us. Sparks rose from the candles in front of their feet, signaling their commitment to us. At a motion from Grandma, everyone in the circle bent to retrieve their candle, and we all walked into the house. When we returned, the lights were all on, and the house was decorated for a huge party. I hadn't had time to see how many people were in the circle outside. I was surprised to see more and more people coming in after us. Many were people I'd never met before. Olivia found me and asked me to join her outside. She took both my hands and squeezed them. "I don't know how you did it, but you saved my life today." I didn't know how I did it either. I hoped I'd figure it out with more training. "If there's anything you need, all you need to do is ask me." "That's very kind of you, but I don't know."
Life as a witch can be difficult sometimes, and I promise there will be times you won't know who to trust. You will be able to trust me no matter what. I owe you at least that much. It was nice to have a witch friend outside my family, but it also felt weird. I wasn't sure she'd ever be the first person I went to, though. After an hour of mingling with our guests and rehashing the events of the morning, Thea, Delia, and I decided we'd had enough. We climbed the stairs to my room, hung up our robes, and got ready for bed. I drifted off to sleep, wondering about my future and if there was any use for a witch who solved crime. The end. This has been Root Cause, an Isabella Proctor cozy paranormal mystery short story. Written by Lisa Bouchard. Copyright 2021 by Lisa Bouchard. Production copyright by Lisa Bouchard.